Hi, Ho Keegan Vlog here. Welcome back to BMW Wrench Time, everybody's favorite BMW Wrench Time. This is a Getrag 260 slant 5, a 5-speed Getrag 260 transmission. This came out of an E28. It was intended for an E30 installation swap. However, it got complicated, and in this video, I'm going to give you the top 5 gotchas on manual swapping a 1980s and early 90s 325 E30 BMW. Let's get into it. Okay, coming in at number 5 is e30 cars versus I cars. e30 being the Greek letter that we call E versus I. Now, roughly 1988 is the transition year between the e30 and the I cars. The main difference here and the biggest problem with the swapping is if you have an e30 car, you can't use an I transmission because the I transmissions do not have the attachment points, the holes in the bell housing for the crank sensors. So I'll probably flash to actual footage of these installed, but these holes right here have sensors that plug into them, and that tells the engine computer where the engine is in its rotation. And that is the main difference between the two when you're concerning a swap. Now, if you have an I car, you can use an e30 transmission. You would just need to do, I have plugs in the holes, and honestly it might be an early I transmissions I think had the holes, but BMW put plugs in them. So you would have to get some sort of rubber plug or some way to plug that hole up. You just don't want that hole being there where stuff can get into the bell housing. But that being said, you absolutely can use an e30 transmission in an I car, but you cannot do the other way around. If those holes are not there, you will not be able to mount your crank sensors and your engine is not going to function. So the e30 cars were actually a bigger displacement engine. They were not, and the M20 engine was a 2.7, I believe. So bigger displacement, had a flatter torque curve, didn't have a lot of horsepower. So it was often compared to a diesel engine, like a smooth running diesel engine, where it had a lot of low end torque, not a lot of high end power. And it was a specific American market car, American market response to the era of the oil crisis and the 55 mile an hour speed limit and all of that stuff. So if you have one of these cars, a 325 or a 528, and it says E after it, that is an e30 car, and the ones that have no badging are typically e30 cars as well. So if it just says 325 and it doesn't have an E or an I after it, it's an e30 car. Number 4, the Driveshafts. This one was quite a learning experience for me. So the first thing about the driveshafts on an E30 driveshaft, the rear section of every E30 driveshaft is exactly the same. Has the same flange, is the same length. This is all the same. They are exactly the same. Any rear section will work in any 325 swap. However, you typically don't just have a rear section unless you have like a parts car or you have a just giant stash of BMW parts, which we do. The drive shaft for the automatic transmission is shorter because the transmission is longer. So the front section of an automatic drive shaft, which I have here, is quite a bit shorter than a manual one. The manual version is going to have to flash to some footage because it's already on the car. there are some differences in that too, and that really is because of the bodies of the convertibles and the later E30 chassis. The transmission tunnel, the driveshaft tunnel under the car, gets smaller, gets shallower on they sometimes called the Generation 2 or the final generation of the E30s. So there was a big counterbalance weight thing, big circle mass at the front. They don't fit in the newer cars. I mean, they fit, you can install it, but what happens is it interferes with the shifter mechanism. So we found that out the hard way. You can remove that mass from the front of the older style front drive shaft. You have to get new hardware to bolt the flange up to the car, because the bolts that are on that drive shaft are pressed into that piece. So you can use that drive shaft. You just have to remove the circular counterweight dampener mechanism that's on there. If you get a new drive shaft from one of the drive shaft places, even for the newer or even for the older cars, they don't come with that weight anymore. So you can use, obviously you can use the one without the weight on the older cars, but what you can't do is use the older one with the weight on the newer cars, because you run into clearance issues with the shifter mechanism. Number 3, the wiring. Yes, the wiring. So the manual transmissions have a different wiring setup than the automatic transmissions. Now, here's what is not as common to find when you are watching the videos on doing this swap. The automatic transmission versions of the 325s were from the factory modified standard transmission cars. That's why they're called standard. So the wiring to make all the automatic stuff work, like the reverse lights and the starter lockout, so it's in park or neutral before you can engage the starter, is a modified wiring harness that plugs into the standard wiring harness of a 325. You do not need to splice wires to make this work. Let me repeat that. You do not need to cut wires. You do not need to do all of the stuff that you see all of these videos out there when they're doing their manual swaps. They're splicing wires and you need to unplug 2 things and plug in this and 1 wire under the dash, and that's it. Good to go. And I'm going to be showing you videos on or we're going to be flashing to that happening. So when you watch these videos, yes, you can do it that way, but it's unnecessary. Unplug the wiring harness for the automatic, plug in the wiring harness for the manual. Now, if you want the clutch switch to function, you will have to install a clutch switch, which means you will have to have the bracket. Most people forget the bracket when they install the pedals into the pedal assembly, assuming they don't take the entire pedal assembly out. We're going to talk about that next. You don't need to do that. You can just put the brake pedal and the clutch pedal in the bracket that is in your car, and that seems to me to be much easier than taking the whole bracket out of the car, especially on the newer one. But there's a little bracket that goes on the pedal assembly that holds the clutch switch. BMW from the factory, if it's an automatic car, has the plug for the clutch switch jumped. And it's already done, so there is basically no clutch safety switch. You can engage the starter with the car in gear. Not a big deal. Your car will work fine. You just will be able to engage the starter with it in gear and jerk it forward if you need to. It actually comes in handy if you need to get it off the road if you're broken down. But anyway, that's the wiring. That's the wiring in a nutshell. Okay, the pedals. Yes, the pedals. Where to start? So my donor car was an E28. As a matter of fact, it was this E28 right here. A fun fact, the pedals, the clutch pedal and the brake pedal, are the exact same part number as the E30. So that part of the swap was no big deal. A lot of people are removing the pedal box, the whole assembly with the pedals still installed, because there's 4 bolts and it's got all of the hardware for, it's got like the master cylinders attached to it and stuff like that. So they'll take the whole thing, unbolt that from the whole assembly from the car and put in the pedal assembly and call it good. Yeah, that's pretty easy unless you have a newer car that has an airbag. And we have a newer car that has an airbag. So the problem with that is the whole pedal assembly is integrated with the steering column on the airbag cars, and you basically have to remove the steering column in order to get that pedal assembly out. It is much, much easier to just take the through bolt that bolts the brake pedal into the pedal assembly out, take the brake pedal out, and then take the 2 pedals that you need. It has just a longer bolt that goes through them, and install that into the existing bracket in the car. Much, much easier to do it that way if you have an airbag car. If you do not have an airbag car, go for it. Take the pedal assembly out. It's fun. Okay, and number one, woo! The transmissions themselves. This was the most confusing part to me because I started with a E28 donor car that had the M20 power plant in it, the M20 powertrain in it. The 528Es had M20 engines. They were supposed to be the economy version of the 5 Series. So it had a little bit smaller of an engine, had the M20 instead of the M30. So I thought I was all good because it was the same engine, same transmission. Well, the E30 or the Getrag 260 5 speeds had 3 generations of production. The very early generation, the first generation, had a completely different shifter mechanism set up than the follow-ons and the ones that are most common in 325s. So they started much earlier. The 5 Series, the 528s are a little bit older than the 325s. So what we have here is the earliest version of the transmission, as you can see here. Now the differences between this transmission and the one that I ended up using, 2 very big deal things. The distance between this flat, where the slave cylinder connects on the outside, and the edge of the bell housing is deeper than the newer transmissions. I say that again. The distance between where the mount for the slave cylinder is on the transmission and the edge of the bell housing is deeper on the oldest version of the Getrag 260s. That can be dealt with in a couple ways. Dual mass flywheel is, I think, the reason why, because the 5 Series had the dual mass flywheel. Or you can put a different throwout, a deeper throwout bearing in, which of course is quite a bit more expensive than the standard one that you would get for a 3 Series, of course. The other big difference, and this is the one that really kind of did it in for me, was the rear casing on these transmissions are different. The newer transmissions, the ones that go in the E30, have a casting on the top of the rear casing of the transmission to accept the mechanism that holds the shifter. Up about here. Sticks up here. And it sort of looks like this, but not really. This bracket apparently is, for this purpose, was put into the very first E30 M3s. They used this transmission, this version of the transmission. And this bracket was fabricated in order to accept the shifter mechanism for an E30. We didn't try to install it. I don't know if it would work. The reason I say that is because the point at which that arm mounts is much, much further aft than the E30 transmission. So the ears that accept the shifter mechanism is further forward on the E30 version of the Getrag, the newer version of the Getrag transmissions. So basically when I saw that, I decided I'm just gonna go forward with an e30, a newer version of the Getrag 260 transmission. But in theory, you can make this work for an e30 swap. It just takes a little bit more patience and some special things. As I said before, the second generation of this transmission for the Ada cars had the correct casing, the rear casing that accepts the e30 shifter, and it also has the holes on the bell housing for the crank sensors to go into. You can see them right here. If you have an e30 donor car, that's probably the transmission that you're going to have. Most of them were the Adas, and they were the second generation of the Getrag 260 transmission. So that is by far the most common transmission, and it's the easiest one to work with. It's going to work in any 325 swap that you're going to deal with. So the I transmissions are essentially the second generation without the holes for the sensors, because the I cars have the sensor on the engine, not on the transmission. And to make it super confusing, version 1 and version 2 of the Getrag 260 have the same part number. They share the same part number. So be careful. If you're shopping the internet by part number and you come across a Getrag 260, look at the pictures. The dead giveaway is the back of the transmission. It won't have the little ears for the shifter mechanism. So those tend to be a little bit cheaper. They're older. They probably have more miles on them, but the applications are a little bit different. The transmission for the iCars, the Getrag 260s that went into the 325i's, did get its own part number. So if you do search for that part number, you should come across the right transmission. Again, if you have an iCar, if you get that transmission and you have an Ada car, it's not going to work for you. You're not going to be able to use the sensors that you need in order to make the engine run. So be careful. I am going to link to a couple of resources online that has a lot of detail on the 3 versions of the transmissions. It was super helpful for me, and it has all of the stuff that I just told you in paragraph form and in bullets. Also has links to pictures, and that really helped. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of BMW Wrench Time, the top 5 gotchas on an E30 manual transmission swap. Hope this helps you if you're thinking about doing the job and maybe finding it hard to know if you've got the right parts. Highly recommend getting a parts car. Get the parts car that matches your application. It makes it much easier. You don't have to guess whether or not you got the right part. Anyway, I think next up on BMW Wrench Time, we are going to do a Getrag 260 swap into an E28. And again, we have an E28 parts car, so it's going to be a little bit easier than the 325 swap. So if you want to see the 325 swap, that's in another video series, link in the description. See you next time, BMW Wrench Time.